Welcome to Around the Empire, a fully independent podcast. Lend your support, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, rockfin.com/aroundtheempire, or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a special edition recorded on 4th of July, and today I talk with a researcher who's well known on Twitter and goes by the pseudonym Gumby for Christ. We talk about his research on the COVID origins, lab leak theory, the pandemic in general, and how, because it's 4th of July, how the basic freedoms and rights in our society have been impacted by the response to all of it. We recorded this on July 4th, 2021. Welcome to a special edition of Around the Empire. I'm recording this on 4th of July, so we're going to make it a 4th of July holiday special. And we have a special guest whose pseudonym is Gumby for Christ. You may know him from Twitter. He's a great researcher, and he has done a large amount of work on this whole COVID thing, and particularly this lab leak curious situation, that it's now suddenly a hot topic when it was a forbidden topic just a few months ago. Well, I guess 6 months ago. But anyway, thanks so much for coming on the show and doing this with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is a pleasure. I've been a long-time listener, so it's a thrill to be a guest.
And I'm a longtime follower on Twitter, and I've been catching up on a couple of your recent interviews that I will link in the show notes for listeners who want more of a deep dive on the research, discussion, on the whole topic of what the heck is going on with this lab leak thing, how credible it is. And there are two fairly recent interviews, one very recent on the Media Roots podcast, and I'll link that in the show notes for people who are curious and want to dig a little. Well, I'm not sure how deep we'll go, but if they want, definitely I would call it a deep dive interview. And even that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you guys did do pretty deep dive, but there were so many threads you could have gone on. You could have done, 5-6 deep dives.
Yes.
That's how complicated this topic has become, because there are a lot of players, because of the topic, because of secrecy, for lots of reasons. But
yeah,
before we dig in, and both of us are, very concerned about the impact of all of it, regardless of what happened. I personally am really worried about the pandemic measures that were taken and where it could lead, the shock doctrine type nature of it. And so since it's 4th of July, it's a great time to talk about that, because, there are some basic freedoms that are under threat, that are really at risk right now. And, maybe some people are tired of hearing about that, but, we're going to talk about some specifics that we've seen. And it's a topic that I can apologize in advance to listeners who might be sick of it, but I'm actually not going to stop talking about that part. So anyway, before we start that, if you would generally with new guests, I just ask them to give a little background, and just first time on the podcast, just, tell us a little about yourself, if you would.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a nobody, I guess is what it comes down to. I mean, I started this Twitter account, Gumby for Christ, with the number 4 in there, about 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, I think, or maybe 6. And it really started, it was a lot different when I started it, because it was really just like, I would drink a little bit and I'd get angry at, like, liberals or something. And so it was kind of a troll account, actually, when I started it. And the idea was that if I had this really stupid handle and I would angrily reply to someone, almost inherently it would be silly if they replied to me because they would be replying to Gumby for Christ. And so it's just like an absurd name that didn't really have anything to do with anything, that was just kind of meant as a, I guess, sort of a troll tactic. But that was, I guess, relatively short-lived. I'm sure there's still some dumb tweets from early in my account's history there, but it sort of pivoted, or I pivoted toward being more interested in just, I would do these kind of little mini deep dive kind of things on particular topics, usually history, deep politics in the like Peter Dale Scott sense, and covert politics, whatever you want to call it. And so I would kind of compile threads, or just post about different things, whatever is interesting to me. But it was usually framed as somewhat original research, sometimes just highlighting an article, sometimes I'm digging through some older files or records or whatever, kind of just wherever the research would take me. And so that's really what the account's been about for the bulk of the last certainly 3 or 4 years. And I'm based in St. Louis, which was a little funny that as a joke a long time ago, I had set my location to Langley, Virginia, which was, I thought, kind of an obvious joke, the CIA headquarters. It's just a thing.
Because people from Langley don't admit they're from Langley, right?
Yeah, generally you wouldn't put the location data if you were really a CIA agent, infiltrating Twitter or whatever. But it has confused some people, and we may get to this, but the Global Times, which is the official, one of the official news organs of the Chinese Communist Party, wrote up an article on Fort Detrick and cited to some FOIA stuff that I had done related to Fort Detrick and the shutdown that happened in 2019. And so they didn't reference my name, but they did reference a Virginia-based Twitter user.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Oh well.
Yeah, I mean, it's I can understand the mistake. It wasn't the relevant
thing anyway, but yeah.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the name came from a meme, I guess, that was popular at the time.
No, not really. It came from I don't know where it came from, to be honest. It just came from, part of the construction of it, I guess, was that when I was in college, there was this group that was like a Christian group on campus, and our university's team name was the Bulldogs. So they were called Dogs for Christ. And something about that always just struck me as funny.
I got it, yeah.
And so I don't know where Gumby came. I mean, I kind of like
Gumby's popular on the internet. There's Gumby everywhere.
I started making a list at one point of people with Gumby in their avatars. It's just something, just a little hobby when I'm on Twitter to add people if I see them. And so I have a list compiled now of all the people with Gumby in their avatars.
All your relatives.
Yeah, exactly. Distant cousins and such. And there's even an account that's called Gumby Screens, and they just do it's one of those bot accounts that tweets out screenshots of all from Gumby episodes. So sometimes that provides with good content for me.
Yeah. I don't know why Gumby is. There's a lot of mysterious things. I guess there are deep internet historical creatures who could tell you the origins of it, but
I'm sure. Yeah.
I don't know why Gumby's such a convenient figure. I guess I don't know. That's not what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, there was a kind of weird animated, I don't know, art group collective thing called Paper Rad. And this is just my own personal history with Gumby, but they posted these kind of, I don't even know how you describe them, but kind of like absurdist cartoons that would get very trippy and weird. And they did one on Gumby that was always stuck in my head somehow as so I always associate Gumby a little bit with that, as well as the original actual Gumby creation.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not an expert on memes, but locally I have a local expert who can explain most of them to me. Thank goodness, because. But anyway, so should we also uh, on your podcast with Rob, you mentioned kind of like why the bioweapons research and biowarfare,
Oh, sure.
or even just I don't even know. I'm not quite sure what the high level topic to put it in, but why that sort of strikes a nerve to you. I've got one of my own too, which I'll share after you're finished.
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been my, I guess, pinned tweet for a while, and it relates to a family history thing. So I grew up in St. Louis. My parents are both from St. Louis, and in around 2012, this woman named Lisa Martino Taylor got some local media attention because she had done this dissertation and had done a FOIA and gotten a bunch of documents related to this incident that happened. And what it was that in the 50s and then again in the 60s, the U.S. Army, it was under the auspices of the U.S. Army with some of these kind of elite nuclear scientists or scientists researching radiological phenomenon, did a experiment in the city of St. Louis. And what they did is they posted two different aerosol sprayers, and they sprayed out what they called simulants. The idea, at least the original cover story is that it was some kind of weather phenomenon, cloud cover, something, the usual kind of BS. And then from there, it became, well, what we're trying to do is simulate if there was a nuclear attack, how would the radiation, we want to simulate how would the radiation fallout kind of disperse in the population. And so officially they use zinc cadmium sulfide, and that is known to be toxic, at least to some degree. Cadmium is a toxic substance. And so so what they did is they had posted these two aerosol sprayers, and just night after night they would turn on the sprayer, and they had posted up collection devices kind of around the neighborhood, sprayed it out, and apparently collected from the collector mechanisms how they dispersed among the area where they were spraying it. And so my mom and her family, they grew up in a kind of a small house apartment thing, and so it was my mom, grandma and grandpa, and my two aunts and my uncle all in this house, and they lived there, and they were within maybe 2 blocks of where one of the spraying points was, which is, for if anybody listening is in St. Louis, at kind of Grand and Gravois. And the other was posted at Pruitt-Igoe, which more people may know of because it was a very big, prominent public housing development that had a troubled history that was probably intentionally troubled. There's a great documentary about it called The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, about what really happened with that housing development, but they ended up demolishing it in the 70s. And so later in life, my uncle got a pretty rare form of throat cancer that is only really common, I believe, in Vietnamese fishermen. And he had cancer treatment, went into remission a few times. He ended up dying at the age of 39, which was pretty emotional for me because I was pretty close. I was very close with my uncle, and he was, one of my best friends, I guess, when I was a kid, really. But my mom also had Hodgkin's lymphoma, which thankfully recovered from, and it came up basically right around the same time all of these things happened, in the early 90s, I guess you'd say. And my aunt gave birth. She had a lot of trouble carrying a pregnancy to term, and then finally did, and gave birth to a baby with, I forget the medical term for it, but there's a sac that forms, and all of the organs are in the sac outside of the body. So a birth defect. And my aunt also had a kind of like pain and neurological issues, and found that she had tumors on her brain. My grandpa also died of skin cancer, and that may be a little more indirectly what you would relate to it. But
Basically the whole family, right?
yeah, pretty much the whole family, other than my grandma did have an aneurysm, but that was something she was born with, so I don't think that's really related. But yeah, pretty much everybody who lived in the house had a pretty bizarre, distinct medical issue, all of which came up when they in the early 90s, so right around the same time.
So
And
it took a lot of years for it to develop, so hard to tie
yeah,
back. But the
it,
research showed a correlation there.
well, that's unclear, and that's a little more speculative. But this woman, Lisa Martino Taylor, wrote a book, because it's very hard to trace any medical
Yeah.
issue like that to a particular cause. And there's other nuclear history in St. Louis. They actually like refined the uranium that they used for the atom bomb right across the river. And there's actually a pretty good HBO documentary about this called Atomic Homefront. But they basically took all of the like nuclear waste that you get from that, and just like drove it in like open trucks
Mm-hmm.
to this landfill in North County, and they just covered it over. And for a long time, people in North County, which is kind of the opposite side of the metro area from where my family grew up, lots of people have had cancer and birth defects and things like that, which, very likely are related to the nuclear waste that's in the ground there. But one of the interesting little weird details about this is that, and my mom remembers doing this, is that in the early 60s, they were trying to get a nuclear test ban, which did end up happening. And this is one of the things that did it, was in St. Louis. This is where it started. They did a baby tooth collection or milk tooth collection. And so the idea was that they were collecting baby teeth of these kids, and they would send them in, and you'd get a little button, and my mom may still have the button somewhere that says, "I donated my teeth to science." And I had like a big smiling kid with a tooth missing. And they collected these, and the idea was that they were testing, because they were doing all this nuclear testing out west. They were seeing, is this getting into the milk supply through the water? The cows drink the water, the cows give milk, the kids drink the milk, the kids end up getting effects from the radiation. But what Lisa Martino Taylor heavily suggests in her book is that that's not really what they were testing. What they were testing is that, well, I should backtrack for a second. So zinc cadmium sulfide is the official substance that was sprayed, which is a little bit toxic, but not necessarily the worst thing ever that you could spray on people. But she, in her book, suggests pretty strongly that it may have actually been combined with strontium-90, which is radioactive. I mean, that is a radioactive isotope right there. So her interpretation is that this milk tooth study wasn't really about finding out how fallout from the nuclear bombs was flowing into the milk supply, but was rather testing. It was the testing mechanism for the spraying. So because strontium-90 creates calcium buildups in your body, and so your teeth end up like hardening in a much different way than they would otherwise. So her theory is that this milk tooth study that was the reason for it, because what they were really doing is testing out a radiological weapon on an American population of, relatively lower working class to poor people in this area. And my own personal interpretation is that we know from, for example, there's mustard gas studies where they did racial separation. So they would test mustard gas on black people and white people and test see if there was a difference in the way that it affected people. And Pruitt-Igoe was almost entirely black development, actually almost by law. they segregated them, and there's a whole history to that. And the area my parents grew up in was predominantly, overwhelmingly, almost completely white. So it looks like there, to me anyway, it looks like there may have been a kind of intention to test out weapons on different racial populations and see if it affects them differently.
Yeah. And I would say back then, I mean, there were still organizations, institutions with the name eugenics
Yeah. Oh yeah.
in their title, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this was something I was just looking at recently, but actually George H.W. Bush was a big eugenicist. And this wasn't really talked about that much, even among, people critical of him, but he was like head of a committee in the Senate or House, whichever one he was in the 60s. And it didn't officially have the name eugenics, but it was all based around the idea that there's going to be overpopulation in the globe. And, there was this Club of Rome, which was all about this fear that, the earth would be overrun with people. But it was even worse than that, because George H.W. Bush's thing had to do with specifically the downbreeding of genes. And so he was, and he convened this whole commission where they brought on explicit racists, explicit eugenicists, who would talk about how we need to sterilize. We should pay. This was the idea. So it was a combination of like Milton Friedman libertarianism with this eugenics stuff. And they were, the idea was that you would pay people with sub-average IQs to voluntarily sterilize themselves, so that you could increase the intelligence of the population through selective breeding. But you would do it voluntarily. You would pay people to do it. And so this was a big thing that George H.W. Bush was involved in, and Donald Rumsfeld was actually put in charge of the Office of Economic Opportunity, I think it was called, which was kind of tasked with carrying out a bunch of the stuff. And he was like a cabinet level position in the Nixon White House to do family planning type stuff, to what looks like to look at, can we basically make less stupid people or make less black people, or
Yeah. Or, yeah, that could be particularly with the the advance of the genetic sciences fields, that could go in a lot of different directions now.
Yeah.
But there are some people, this is a thing I don't even want to touch. I don't even want to go there, just from a psychological standpoint. It's just very, you know what I mean? It's just so upsetting. And it also, I feel like, whenever you go down this road, people are going to like just turn you off. That's just too, it's too evil. You know what I mean? It's too conspiratorial, the whole thing. It's easy to knock down on oh, get out of here. Partly because other people don't ever even want to think that things could like that could happen. But there was some pretty open, very open, and they weren't just discussing among themselves. I just last night came across this one thing. There was a committee from 1967 to 70. I think it was John D. Rockefeller, a commission that he headed, and it was it addressed population growth and the future of America, that kind of thing. And they are still talking about that, right? On the Rockefeller website, they're still referring back to it. And some of the things that they were proposing then are things that are popping up again, like, we should shut down the farms. We should certainly shut down the any meat production or processing, and we should produce we should only plants and lab developed protein, meat, all the fake meat type things.
Right.
That goes back to, like there was a big report that they produced that looks an awful lot like what's coming up again. So
Hmm.
that's a little bit off topic, but all of these things, put them together. Oh, and I said that I would. So I guess the bigger point is that we have less trouble believing some of the more nefarious possibilities. And even if you're keeping an open mind, there are some things that are just very hard to even go there to believe.
Right.
Like why would our own, we could say our own government, but we're at this point we're not talking about just governments, we're talking about conglomerate, partnerships and conglomerations. But I guess back then it was fairly more divide. The divide was more visible. There, there was the government, and there were the corporations and the foundations. But I think there was a little bit more of a separation between them. Although I just said that Rockefeller led that commission, so I don't know. Maybe it wasn't.
Yeah.
But the lab leak thing at first was a forbidden topic. Like, oh my God, that's just a big conspiracy theory. There's no way that could have happened. It came from nature. It was a naturally developed thing. But now all of a sudden, oh, that big obvious elephant in the room, people are just suddenly we're now allowed to talk about that. And it is, I'd call it mainstream now. It is now the mainstream, most likely scenario. But we also know that the vaccine development industry, the biodefense industry, has a partner in the bioweapons industry. And right up until the 1980s, I believe it was still, oh no, I guess it was under Nixon, they outlawed bioweapon development, technically outlawed it. And then in
Right.
Francis Boyle wrote the bioweapon convention law in the 80s. So that, in fact, I never looked at what happened between in that decade there. Why did they need to follow up with that? I'm not sure if that was a technicality, it was already outlawed, or why that bioweapons convention
Well,
hadn't.
it was because the Bioweapons Convention was signed on an international level in the 70s, like you said, by Nixon. And then there was no implementing legislation in the United States. So while technically, if you did biological weapons development and testing, it would violate the international treaty or international agreement, there was no domestic implementation of that. So what Francis Boyle did is he wrote the domestic implementing legislation. So that's what made it, it's not only violating a treaty, but it's actually violating U.S. law.
Okay.
To do biological weapons testing as of 1989, I think, or somewhere around then is when that legislation was passed.
Yeah. And there were a lot of problems during the Reagan years. So I guess if it came through in 89, it would have been technically Bush, but I'll just call it the Reagan years. So the so technically you're not allowed to do that unless unless it can be framed as biodefense, which it has been. And so essentially that business has continued under the smokescreen of biodefense. Now, I don't think anybody, I would hope most people realize that we still develop bioweapons, right?
Yes.
And then also, and we'll probably talk about this more later, and it's been taken further to justify it, given this facade of gain of function research, which is actively going out, seeking out biological organisms in the name of potentially defending from future threats, that kind of thing. I think there are some more legitimate uses for it, but it's basically weaponizing existing viruses, germs too, I guess. I mean, bacteria too, I guess. But, taking them and helping them jump species, helping them be more contagious and more deadly,
Hmm.
and then developing, or at least sort of banking the information to be able to create a vaccine for it. So that's a thing. And so my the reason why I don't have so much trouble believing that these things can happen and they can affect, sort of, why would you do that to your own people? That's the big question.
Hmm.
Why? It makes no sense. And but my health was wrecked by Lyme disease, right?
Hmm.
So, and it was a situation where I clearly had Lyme disease for years, and I would tell my doctor about it. I get the test, and the screening tests are pretty much crap. But we took it down to the more detailed test, which is called a Western blot, and it kept coming up negative. However, there are several different. It's not a simple yes or no test. There are bands you can test positive for, one of a number of bands. So if let's say you have, I don't know, you it comes back positive for 3 bands, but that's not enough for a what the, I guess, CDC calls positive. So mine kept coming up with some of the bands positive, but not enough technically to be positive. So therefore, an insurance, a doctor wouldn't give you that diagnosis. An insurance company wouldn't pay for treatment for it. And there were some other health issues going on that made it more complicated. It was like peeling layers of an onion. So I trusted my doctor, but I just kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker to the point where um, it was killing me. So I started reading some more about it. The On the internet, in fact, there were lots of people like me. I don't know how many people, thousands and thousands, maybe millions. I don't know. There is one area in this general area, southeastern Pennsylvania, where there are hot spots. That's one of them. And so I start on the internet. There were people with similar problems because the doctors would just sort of brush them off, um, and they started to compare notes, and they figured out what was going on. And there were some doctors who themselves suffered from Lyme disease, and they sort of started specializing in that. And so some doctors, groups of doctors formed, and people came to know which doctors would treat. We were called specialists, or they were in the know, and people started getting better. And at the same time, there was a lot of concern about antibiotics, the overuse of antibiotics, and there, as a result, superbugs forming. So some doctors had some real legitimate concerns, but at the same time, people were becoming permanent, really, really bad things. And then there were a whole other swath of people who they weren't disabled, or weren't disabled yet, but their lives were pretty much wrecked. So anyway, we went to one of these Lyme sort of specialist doctors who diagnosed me clinically. He said, "You clearly have Lyme disease." And he explained the reasons why these tests were flawed, seriously flawed. And then there's a political aspect to it too, in that there was a small number of doctors on a panel in Connecticut who basically controlled the whole protocol. They had financial interest in the tests themselves, and they were sort of the roadblock to this whole thing. And it was extremely strange. I could not believe that there could be anything like this in the medical establishment. I thought the medical establishment was not perfect, but I didn't really think of them as very corrupt. And I didn't even know anything yet about the deeper story to it. So anyway, uh, Senator Blumenthal in Connecticut was, I believe, the Attorney General in Connecticut at the time. And it just kept bubbling up and bubbling up to the point where politically the pressure was so high they had to do something about it. he said that he would investigate this panel of doctors. There were some negative consequences from that, but I don't know if anything, I didn't follow up on that. I don't know really what came of that. Like, was anybody ever held accountable? Were they taken out of power? I think some changes were made, but I don't think fundamentally, I don't think there's any real accountability. But some more people started looking into it. A few universities started looking into it more because one of the big controversies was that, look, Lyme disease is easy to diagnose and easy to treat. That's what the medical establishment said. Other people were saying, well, look, I've been treated for it, but it just comes back. It flares up. It's a chronic condition. That became a very taboo thing. And that's really the thing that some people started looking into. And some research institutions did find some things on that. And there has been progress without getting too deep into this. So after that, one of the congressmen in my state came out and said that he was going to do an investigation because the rumor was, the conspiracy theory was that Lyme disease originated in a bioweapons laboratory
Right.
in Connecticut.
Plum Island, right?
Yeah, and there were other strange things going on, like doctors some of these Lyme specialists, they had to almost go underground because they were being harassed by, I'm not quite sure who, medical boards. They were being harassed by authorities. Some of them had licenses removed and things like that. Yeah. So, and then in Pennsylvania, the state legislature, I believe it was, sort of started standing up for the doctors because it just got, gave them some protection. And so it did get to some point where there was some progress made on it, but I don't know what came of. I'll go back and look at that too. Like, what came of this investigation that this congressman was going to do? It came out in the open, and so I don't know if that's where it originated. But there's an awful lot of strange things around it. These gatekeepers,
Right.
The CDC some years ago apparently had to finally acknowledge that it was like at I don't know what the number threshold is to become an epidemic, but it was like at an epidemic level. And then some celebrities came out. In fact, I think a senator was it North Carolina, actually died of it. Don't quote me on that because I didn't check my facts before I started this, but it became more public. It basically they couldn't prevent it any longer from making it out into the public. And my personal experience on a blog back when I was back when I realized that there was someplace else to go, and that maybe I ought to look at one of these Lyme specialist doctors, because I personally was still skeptical. I believed my doctor.
Mm-hmm.
But my partner was like, well, what if we got to lose? And that, by the way, that Lyme specialist doctor, he explained the different kinds of antibody tests, and different stages that your immune system goes through. So sometimes they're looking for things that aren't there at that particular time because of the development of this disease. And so my partner was like, well, what if we got to lose? And the doctor told me, well, I'm going to start treating you, and within 6 weeks, we'll do that Lyme test again, and that test will come back positive. And on my way home, I was like, I don't know, is this guy a quack or what? He's like, look, what have we got to lose? And the guy was right. And it took like 3 years, but they got me back on track. It had done some pretty bad systemic damage by that point, but it didn't kill me. And I can walk and I can function, this kind of thing. So, unlike some other people. So because of that, and your story, I don't have as much trouble believing some of the possibilities that are out there right now. Whereas I am certain that 10 or 20 years ago, I just would not have been able to go there. And I think that's a big thing. I don't think people understand. Also, if you've been in the war and foreign policy analysis, if you've been talking to people, doing the reading, really researching and following things from day to day, you the everybody knows that the military industrial complex is out there and all of that. But I don't know if you really can appreciate the scale of it until you've really been digging into it for a while. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, I didn't know your whole history with Lyme disease. Have you read Chris Newby's book, Bitten?
No, lots of people have told me to read. I haven't read it
Yeah,
yet,
it
but
is a great book, and I can understand if you maybe would not want to dive into it, but it does lay out a lot of the case that Lyme disease was the result of military weapons experiments, and through this guy Willy Bergdorfer, who was the doctor who identified the original uh, Lyme disease virus or whatever um,
yeah,
whatever it's called.
it's named after him.
Right, Bergdorfer or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, she builds a pretty strong circumstantial case, and I believe her interest in it came from a similar experience to you of having chronic Lyme disease and being told that she didn't, and lots of doctors dismissing it. And I remember there was an interview with her on Peter B. Collins. I don't know if you ever listened to his show.
Yeah, he
I
used
think
to be on Newsbud or something. Yeah.
he bounced around, but he was doing an independent show that was pretty good for a while. I think he just officially retired. But anyway, he had Chris Newby and also Mark Crispin Miller, who you may know. He did a lot on the 2004 election.
Yeah, I do. I do know. Yeah.
So apparently Mark Crispin Miller has suffered from chronic Lyme disease
I
as
did
well.
not know that.
Yeah, I didn't know until this came up, and he talks about the brain fog that some people mention, and that he would just look at a document he was trying to read or a book, and just he couldn't focus on it. There was no, his brain just like could not work or function basically.
Yep.
So.
Yep, exactly. Because I was in the IT industry before this. I still am on a part-time basis, but there are certain skills. There's actual nerve damage that gets done,
Right.
and takes a long time to heal. It's a question if it's even ever going to,
Yeah.
if you're ever going to recover. But yeah, there were certain things that I could no longer do. It was really something.
Yeah. But yeah, and it really does match in a lot of ways the COVID narrative, or the way that's shaped as well, where there's a kind of complete suppression of a particular point of view, and then, I mean, it's not quite the same, but the way it has shifted with Lyme disease, where there is a more becoming more openness about it, and now that's happening with COVID. Although with that, there's more of a weaponization of the narrative as well, I guess, in the way that maybe there
Right.
isn't with Lyme disease. But
Right, there is that. But like here, I guess so. Both this kind of bias has affected both of our views. I'll call it bias. I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just
yeah,
the possibilities based on our experience are. I guess you could say that the scope of possibilities is widened because of that, and I think
yeah,
most people would not go there. But the thing is, like, with Lyme, you could see the progression where it was suppressed. And the reason why it is no longer suppressed was just because of public pressure.
mm-hmm.
And it just became too hard to hide. Whereas that did not happen with COVID.
True. Yeah.
This lab leak theory just suddenly became. There were a few people talking about it. I did an interview with Sam Husseini in the spring of 2020, because the arguments were valid then, and they're still valid now. From my view, it was always a possibility. And but but it was, I mean, talk about suppression. So, why is it now okay to talk about that? And I guess I would have to say, why are you only talking about an accidental leak?
Yeah, that's a point that Sam brings up a lot, and is a very good one, because there is no yeah. So it was a complete suppression. I mean, to the first person I heard talk about any idea that COVID could have, or SARS-CoV-2, or it was actually even had a different name at that time, the novel coronavirus 2019, that could have come from a lab, was Francis Boyle, who we mentioned earlier, wrote the implementing legislation for the Bioweapons Convention. In, I want to say it was like January 30th of last year
I
of
think it was the
2020.
20th. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was really, really early on. And he was on the Geopolitics and Empire podcast.
Yep.
And I listened to it, and I remember, he had some information, but it was a little bit tentative. And then it was completely suppressed. It was taken down off of YouTube. You couldn't post a link on Twitter, even, I think, certainly on Facebook, I believe you couldn't post it. I mean, it was suppressed as much as anything could be suppressed. And that was the case for a long time in 2020. Twitter has tended to be a little bit laxer, at least in terms of origin theories. But my understanding is that Facebook, you couldn't really post about it, or you would be, your post would get banned. And that was up until, like, I don't know, sometime early this year, late last year. So there was a complete blackout that was driven by, well, it's not clear. It may have been driven by Fauci, if you read the emails that came out recently in a particular way. He was certainly in correspondence with some of the kind of what I will call elite scientists in the virology, epidemiology circles, and including a guy named Christian Andersen, who ended up being the main author of this Nature Medicine article, which has been the sledgehammer used against anybody talking about a lab origin for the past
That's a
year.
perfect way of putting it.
Yeah. And it's
Early
not,
and
yeah,
with force. Yeah.
right. And it came out in like early March of 2020. There had previously been a Lancet letter, but that one was more generic. It was just like, we don't think it came from a lab, and we stand with the scientists in China. They shouldn't be, you know, harangued in this way or something. And that had its own effect too. But the Nature Medicine piece is the real quote unquote proof, because it concluded, I mean, there was no nuance to it. It concluded this had to have come from nature. There was no way it could have come from a lab. And it based that on what I thought was pretty obviously specious reasoning. Meryl Nass had written about it. A guy who writes a blog called Harvard to the Big House wrote about this pretty early on as well. But even just reading and I'm not a trained scientist, so, I always read it with the idea that I could be missing something. But the reasoning was basically like, well, if you were to create a virus like this in a lab, you would do it in this way. And if you look at the genome, it wasn't done in exactly the way that we just identified. Therefore, it couldn't have been from a lab. That just seemed obviously specious, both for lab origin, where you could have taken a natural virus, put it in a lab, you take it out or whatever to study it, and then it infects somebody, and that's how it gets out there. So in other words, it's a completely natural virus, but it still came from a lab. Or you could have just manipulated the virus in a different way, and there's no sign that it's from a lab. And in fact, we know that Ralph Barrick of the University of North Carolina developed a technique. He called it no-see-um, that is a technique to create coronaviruses in a lab with no sign that you had created that it was lab manipulated. That, in other words, there's usually kind of a signature, quote unquote, in the genome that would tell you, okay, this kind of came from a lab. Whereas his technique did not, was specifically designed to not do that. So
Yeah.
there was no, the rationale and the reasoning of the argument was never strong. And you add on to that there has still not been any really even official explanation of how it came from nature. I mean, that is as speculative as people talking about it coming from a lab. So you had to weigh the two, and there was no weighing that was going on at all, really, other than there were some people out there, a group on Twitter called Drastic, they went by that acronym, and a person I've focused on and thought was doing some good work, and have come to think maybe is playing a sort of a gatekeeping role, named Alina Chan.
Yep.
Um, and she was probably the most prominent person. I mean, I heard a guy named Antonio Regalado, I think is his name, who's a journalist for MIT Technology Review, and he basically said, like, Alina Chan's Twitter was the one-stop shop for any journalists interested in this. In other words, if you wanted to follow this story from a quote-unquote credible person and get the credible information about lab origin, her Twitter was the place to go.
Yeah, that's clearly the role that she's playing. And you
Yeah,
know, in one of your interviews, you said you took a look at her Twitter account, like to see activity, and there was
yeah,
an obvious point in time when, like, all of a sudden it became an active. Well, I'll let you explain it.
yeah. I mean, if you go back and look, she did not tweet almost anything until May of 2020, I think, late May, if I'm remembering correctly. I mean, really nothing at all. She had a few tweets, but they were just like the kind of tweets a professional person might have out there.
Hmm.
And then all of a sudden, it's like every day, 20, 30 tweets a day, she's doing this.
Almost like she got a job.
Yeah, it is. And I don't know, I never looked at the timestamps, because there's been this would probably be, you know, something worth doing, but she works for the Broad Institute. It's spelled BROAD, so it looks like Broad, but it's Broad Institute, which is a some kind of lab that's affiliated with both Harvard and MIT. And it was it was actually set up by Eric Lander, who is has pretty close Epstein associations, and is now Biden's cabinet level science advisor. So, you know, you're talking about the most elite world of scientific research here,
Yeah.
the Broad Institute. And they would always say, when asked, and still are saying this because articles are still being written about her, that, you know, this is just freelance. She's doing it on her own. This has nothing to do with the Broad Institute. We take no position one way or the other. She speaks purely for herself. But the amount of tweets she does and the amount of time devoted to it, I would almost think would have to overlap with working hours. I mean, I don't know what her, you know, maybe she has a different kind of contract or something, but it seems very odd that she was tweeting so much while having, you know, what I would assume to be a full-time job. Now, maybe I guess she's probably working from home, as people were. And, you know, I certainly, you know, probably tweet more from work than I should too. But anyway, my point is just that the amount of stuff that she was putting out there really feels like she was placed into the role to be the person who is like the credible person, talking about lab origin, filtering out all the crazy stuff or the stuff that maybe we don't want to talk about, like, you know, Fort Detrick or Ralph Barrick,
Yeah.
actually. Because this was the reason that I turned on her, quote unquote, because I was following her and I thought she was an independent researcher who was doing, you know, good work, kind of making the legitimate, credible case for lab origin. And what I discovered, or not really discovered, but this letter came out in March of this year, I want to say, or maybe February or March, doesn't matter, in Science magazine. And it was this big letter, and it's one of the key pieces that helped kind of break open the story in the public and make lab origin more acceptable. And it was a letter saying we need a new investigation. We can't rule out lab origin. yada, yada, yada. And it was signed by Alina Chan. It was signed by a guy named David Relman, who I also had kind of a more favorable view of until recently. And it was co-signed by Ralph Barrick, who, from anybody who had been following this, was a guy who looked very deeply enmeshed in the exact kind of research that may have caused this, virus
Yeah,
to
exactly.
emerge.
At the very least, he's got a serious conflict of interest, and
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, he, the first really big piece of evidence that people pointed to is this 2015 Nature Medicine article that was it was really written by Ralph Barrick. It was Ralph Barrick has a lab at the University of North Carolina, BSL 3+, as he likes to say, where they do all kinds of synthetic viral research. They make coronaviruses in labs, and they make them more infectious than they were before they started the research. And this paper that he did was co-authored, quote unquote, with Shizheng Li, who is the head of the Wuhan Institute of Virology and has been, all over the media in terms of the lab leak theory that she's, suspect number one. And so it was seen to be like, suspicious that he was writing this article with her, which it was, except if you actually look at it, all that the Wuhan Institute of Virology really did was provide the genomic data for a spike protein for a virus that they had in their lab. Then he takes it, he did all the research in his lab and creates this chimeric virus, which is shown to be able to infect human cells. In other words, creating a pandemic potential virus in a lab in North Carolina. And anyway, he has a lot of research and a lot of background. I mean, he's got Fort Detrick connections. He's got connections to Gilead, which formerly run by Donald Rumsfeld. He was developing remdesivir, which was developed to treat Ebola, even though it doesn't work for Ebola, and then is still now the only approved treatment for COVID-19.
and very expensive. Yeah,
Very expensive
under
and
patent.
under patent and doesn't seem to work
Right.
from all the testing. I mean, I don't want to get too much into the ivermectin thing because I've somewhat mixed feelings about that, but certainly I would say there's probably more evidence for ivermectin than there is for remdesivir as far as working. Anyway, so I got sidetracked here on the Barrick thing, but basically this letter came out and she had co-authored it with Barrick, who I think I and a lot of people following this looked at as, one of the primary suspects if you're looking at lab origin. And I kind of went back through her tweets and I saw she's never said anything negative about Barrick. And everything she had said about him was more in the way of a defense of him. And Barrick had been very savvy too, where he'd kind of leaked out little tidbits here and there intimating that he was open to the lab leak hypothesis, that it couldn't be ruled out. And he has an unusual history with that too, where the Lancet letter, which was the first real voice of the scientific community saying, this didn't come from a lab. He was involved in drafting it because he was on these emails that came out through FOIA that this group called US Right to Know got. And it was shown from those emails that Peter Daszak, the head of EcoHealth Alliance, one of the other, huge primary suspects here, had basically drafted the letter, and he got an input from a bunch of different people, including Ralph Barrick. But then kind of at the last minute, Ralph Barrick's name didn't appear on the letter.
Yeah.
For unclear reasons.
And isn't there something in the emails of saying it's like you don't need to be a signatory or something?
Yeah. Basically, we don't want this to look, I forget what the phrasing was, but political or something, or I can't remember the exact phrasing, but basically they were saying, yeah, we don't really want you to sign it because it's going to make people suspicious of it.
Yeah, it was more tame than that, the way they framed it. But
Yeah, they didn't say it that directly. That would be absurd.
I just saw it recently.
Even Peter Daszak was maybe not going to sign it, and then did end up, which was it did make it immediately suspicious that his name was on that letter because of his involvement through EcoHealth Alliance with all kinds of, coronavirus collection research and stuff.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to collect a bunch of links and put. Maybe we can work on a list together. Put them in
Sure.
the show notes here. But the interview, off the top of my head, the interview with RFK Jr. and Meryl Nass, they go into this a
Hmm.
bit. A fairly recent one, maybe a month or so ago.
Yep.
But you know what? Let me put a bookmark here because there is so much, and I'm interested in hearing all of it. But let's shift topics temporarily and then come back to um, the bookmark of, like, let's see, where did we leave off? Basically, the suppression of the lab leak theory and these letters and these
Hmm.
articles and things like that. But I want to make sure that we leave a little time to talk about, maybe we could sort of zero in, like, what were some of the most interesting things that you've seen in what has been censored? Because personally, that's part of my input to my analysis, or to
Hmm.
I'm not doing deep analysis myself. I'm mostly reading other. I've been immersing myself in this for like the past month, but not a lot of source documents and things like that. But basically, the reactions of certain people, what gets suppressed, how the story progresses, things like what you said about Alina Chan. That's a data point, right? The fact that she suddenly becomes um, the person who will attract a lot of attention, and sort of a narrative setter, right? A gatekeeper,
Right.
narrative
Right.
setter. Like, that's part of when you're trying to figure out maybe what you think the truth is or what the possible truths are. You have to take in data like that as part of your analysis, because there's so much secrecy. We don't get the documents. Even when we do get the documents, you've done FOIA requests. I want to talk to you about that too. But essentially, the government can refuse. They can still be selective in what they give you. Things get redacted, right? We know all
Right.
that stuff. But, like, what have you seen? What have been some of the most alarming or illuminating things that you've seen in the censorship of this topic? Maybe like now, and also like in retrospect from what happened before.
Yeah, that's a good question because there's been so much from so many different angles. It's
Yeah.
it's almost hard to get a handle on it. Certainly, the first thing that I remember is what I mentioned with the Francis Boyle interview on geopolitics and empire. That got completely suppressed, and this was kind of much later, but there was an AP article that was it identified the coronavirus misinformation super spreaders, I think is what they said, and identified Francis Boyle as being one of the big ones,
Uh,
um, as well as I can't remember who else was identified. But the funny thing is that right now, what Francis Boyle was saying, he was saying lab leak from Wuhan Institute of Virology, and that is now, if not the dominant point of view, certainly a very major one and all over the media. Um, as far as other suppression, I mean, I know, people I follow like Whitney Webb, The Last American Vagabond, and Corbett Report all got kicked off of Patreon, apparently, and I think that was apparently related to their coverage, or at least this is what they told Whitney, of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which like a bunch of countries banned
yeah.
after, after she gets kicked off of Patreon. Um, and so that's certainly a big one. Oh, Zero Hedge was a big one early on, and I'm not a huge fan of Zero Hedge in a lot of respects because I think they do go down the
It's hit or miss. Yeah.
yeah, they're very anti-China, as a kind of editorial line there, and that had a big part of what to do with um, with their coverage of COVID. But I think the specific thing that they got kicked off for was they highlighted this Indian study, which was a preprint, so it hadn't been peer reviewed yet. And I have mixed feelings about the study. I don't know exactly where I fall on it, but it was saying that there were some inserts in the SARS-CoV-2 genome that matched HIV, and they were very, very small sequences. So that's why it's not really a slam dunk that, this had something to do with HIV. But that got highlighted on Zero Hedge, and that I think is what really got them exploded off of a lot of social media and got them, I think, banned, at least suspended on Twitter for a while. And
Can I just interject here
yeah,
too that it showed up in the Fauci emails, right? So it went
yes,
way up to
yes,
the top.
yeah,
And so if you have
they
any question about why it got shut
right.
down so quickly, well, there's your answer.
Right, and I believe, if I'm not misremembering, there's even an email between Fauci and Zuckerberg somewhere in there, and so there is certainly speculation that Fauci may have leaned on Facebook to get some stuff suppressed there.
And they got banned, they got shut down or suspended from Twitter for a long time too, right? They just came back fairly recently.
Yeah, I'm not sure when, but yeah, it was a pretty massive suspension, and still on Twitter, because I was doing a little bit of digging. It's very opaque how Twitter suppresses things and bans things. But still, if you click on any Zero Hedge link, Twitter pulls up a splash page
The
that
warning.
says this link may be harmful to your computer or something like that. Maybe unsafe, I think is the word they use. And they've done that for several different websites I know of. Global Research gets it on every link. Off Guardian, The Last American Vagabond gets it. Stormfront, interestingly, gets it. The white supremacist website, which there you may be say justified, but yeah. So one thing I was looking at just yesterday was just testing out a bunch of different links of kind of quote unquote fringe websites, and seeing how Twitter treats them, and it's pretty interesting because, for example, Infowars, which Alex Jones got kicked off of Twitter.
Tweaked off everything, I think.
Yeah, kicked off everywhere, but you can post a link to Infowars on Twitter. You can go straight through to it.
Get out.
But
No warning page pops up?
no warning page at all. Whereas the sites I just listed, you get a splash page, and the splash page, it's clearly designed to make it look like not only that this is misinformation, but that you're going to get a virus or something, or
your
it's
computer's
spam.
gonna be
Yeah,
fried.
yeah,
Right.
exactly. That's what they try to make it look like by saying unsafe. And then there are other sites, and this is the most wild version, where you cannot post a link to the site at all. If you try to tweet out a link, it will just not let you. And if you try to post it in a DM, same thing. It just will not let you.
I had that happen to me. I'll tell you real quick.
Sure.
It was the New York Post link to that Hunter Biden thing. And I tried to send it. Yeah, I tried to send it to one of my friends on Twitter in a DM.
Yeah.
DM, we mean private message, right? We're not tweeting this out to the world. We're sending it to one person.
Yep.
And what was the spam error popped up?
Mm-hmm.
They don't even tell the truth about why they're not letting you send it.
No, they make it look like it's some tech issue, failure, your tweet didn't send, who knows, the server is
similar,
down.
I think it was similar to I wish I'd screenshotted it. It was a brand new thing. I didn't realize what was happening. But I think it's the same message that happens when you accidentally send the second message again by accident.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I think they call that spam. Well, it's not really spam, but I guess you're catching spammers. That's a way they catch spammers, is somebody who sends the same thing over and over and over.
Right. And that was an even more bizarre one because that was article specific. So obviously you can post to the New York, or you can link to the New York Post. But that one, they had taken that particular article and said, this just can't be
across the board, the entire all of Twitter. Yeah.
And you know what? There was an interesting thing. Well, I'll get back to it in a minute, but I just wanted to mention. So there are other sites like that, and the one that really piqued my interest is that I was trying to link to a site called All That's Interesting, which is not I wouldn't call it a fringe website at all. It's not conspiracy oriented. It's nothing like a global research, which I could see where people would see, okay, this trafficking and conspiracy theories or something. It's not racist. It's I think one of those sites where the business model is, when you go through an article and then at the bottom there's all these links, like sponsored links, and a lot of them are like
Yeah.
clickbait, like, belly fat
Yeah,
reduction
they get
stuff.
paid for them. Yeah.
Yeah, and so somehow this site, I think their business model has something to do with being populated there, because their links are pretty splashy, but they're historical articles predominantly. And so I know, like, one that I linked to was this, a while back, was this article about how, and the band played on, the Schiltz book about the supposed origin of AIDS and HIV, which, what the article was saying was that, there's a lot of mythology about that, because in the book it's this flight attendant who was patient zero, Gayton, I can't remember his name, Gayton Dugas, I think. And they flew around the world, and, he had a guy in every port, and he had sex with them, and he spread AIDS that way. Well, that turned out that partially may have been true, that he slept around a lot, but he was not patient zero. And this was firmly established, and you can read about it on CNN and all kinds of major, publications. But for some reason, so that was just an example of one of the articles they have. They just have kind of like interesting history type
Yeah.
articles and
Yeah.
some stuff highlighting news, and you cannot link to them. You cannot post a link, DM, or on the main page. Other ones that I know do that, because I was doing some testing, is Mercola.
Yeah.
Is I know that
Is
people
that his
probably,
whole site? That's
his entire site you cannot post to. Strategic Culture, um,
yeah, I'm familiar with that.
yeah, which you cannot link at all. Southfront, which is, I think, kind of similar to Strategic
I'm
Culture.
very familiar with Southfront, but
Okay, yeah,
it's generally situational stuff in the wars
right.
in the
Okay,
Middle East, usually. Yeah. And
you
Ukraine.
cannot post a link to Southfront on Twitter at all. Natural News, also completely banned, and I'm sure there are others. One that I had, the first time I ever saw this, actually, was, there was a thing that happened maybe almost a year ago, where the Gray Zone did an article, and now I'm blanking a little bit on what
Is
the
it the
actual,
OPCW topic? No,
I don't
I don't
think it
think that gets
was.
blocked. Yeah.
Let me see if I can find it real quick. Okay, yeah. So what they had done was an article, and the way they had tweeted it out was, leaked files shows Reuters and the BBC's role in covert British Foreign Office programs to affect, quote, attitudinal change, and, quote, weaken the Russian state's influence.
Oh,
They were joined by
that's what
Intel.
Kit Clarenberg did work on that, and we
Yes, he did.
did an interview on that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and so what they did with this was, this was the whole thing with the Zinc network, and Bellingcat was rolled in there, and all that stuff, and it was a pretty big story. But when you posted their link, and it was a link to a particular article, it came up with a warning on the tweet that said these materials may have been obtained through hacking, and that had never been put on an article before. But what was even more interesting is that if you tried to link directly to the page where the hacked materials were published, because the Gray Zone didn't get those hacked materials, they just did an article based on them, and they weren't even really the first article to do it. Moon of Alabama, I know, had done an article a few days prior, as well. But if you tried to link to the hacked articles, you couldn't do it. They would not let you post it. You couldn't post it in a DM, and that was the first time I had ever seen that. And then I think after that is when the New York Post Hunter Biden thing was, and that was an article specific thing. And now I'm finding that there are at least, whatever I named, 5 websites that you literally cannot link to at all, as well as a bunch that get that splash page that comes up.
Yeah, yeah, there's a whole bunch of different levels of. I'm glad that you're, testing through it. There've been a lot of weird things on Twitter for a long time, and what look
Yeah,
like manipulations. Like first, it seems to be the trending list, and then
yeah,
the shadow banning and the
they're now kind of suppressing replies a lot, where I don't even know how it happens, but like things will get marked as this looks offensive or something, and there's nothing remotely offensive about it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
all kinds of things. You have to click show because it, it
yeah,
doesn't show certain. Yeah, there's just a total, from an IT perspective, their code must be just crazy. I think they totally destroyed their product. Not only
oh,
that, is they have different versions up there. They've got apps and they've got different kinds of apps. Hopefully, they've got a lot of common code in the core of it. But sometimes I come across situations where things are not implemented the same way on the Twitter webpage software versus the TweetDeck software.
mm,
And I think, oh my God, I have a pretty good idea why. I think they've completely destroyed their product, and their code must be a living nightmare
I can only
to
imagine.
to
Yeah.
maintain. Yeah,
The
and
other,
I go
oh yeah,
ahead.
sorry. Oh
Yeah,
no.
uh,
Uh,
what I was going to say is not. It's just trivial. So go ahead.
oh, okay. Well, the other level of censorship from the links that I tested is that I tried just linking to 8kun, which is the current version of what was 8chan.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So it's 8kun. And so anyway, I tried linking to that, and it still shows to me that I linked to it and that I have a tweet with the link in there and that you can click on it and it works. But when I was doing this testing, people were saying, "What is this?" Because they would show me a screenshot, and it would show this tweet is unavailable. So even beyond the you can't post a link and we're going to give you a splash page that looks like a warning, there was some kind of weird suppression going on with this, with at least with 8kun is the only site I've seen it with, where it looks to me like I posted it, and it looks to everybody else like I deleted a tweet or something.
Oh, so it's this a similar message as if the tweet was just gone off the
Yeah,
site.
yeah, it looks exactly to, because it's in a long chain. So, it's a link in a chain, and so that link says this tweet is unavailable. Learn more. So it's being suppressed from everybody else. But if I weren't doing this as a testing thing, I would have thought I just posted that and people would be able to see it.
I've also seen. I wish I could remember what the example was. I know I posted some messages to some friends about it, but uh, and this was a flaw in the software. It was like if you searched for a certain thing on Twitter, it would come back and say no, zero results.
Yeah,
But in the auto, uh, oh damn, I can't think of the term. Um, when it autofills for you,
yeah,
it pops up the suggestions. It was still there and with a number of 227 tweets or whatever.
yeah,
But down below it'd say zero results. So they forgot to tweak that part of the code. You know what I mean?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was like, I can't even believe this. Look at this.
It's such a mess with how yeah, and you can see how the censorship starts to, like you said, break the website essentially.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, I would say that has happened with Google completely, where Google search is now awful. It's so much worse than it was even 5 years ago. Because one part of it is that they're trying to predict what everybody is really searching for, or at least that's what they're saying. But you can search for all kinds of topics, and even if you do very specific, use quotation marks and a very specific type of searching, it still just will not bring up certain things that you should be able to find out there. Or if it does, it's buried under pages and pages. So, and Google News has gotten really bad about being able to search through there in a usable way. Because this is the kind of stuff I would use for research, and I almost always have to like specify dates on a search in Google if I want to get anything useful.
yeah, yeah. And just another little thing that I've noticed. I've come across data scientists here and there where they don't care about the politics at all.
Hmm.
but they're just aghast. They're like, you're wrecking your data. You're ruining your data,
Right.
right? And they're
Yeah.
they're they're just shocked by it. And then another little tidbit is that there's all kinds of panic about there's proliferation in the AI field, right? There's it's become like the nuclear same thing in bioweapons, right? It's clearly a proliferation, things that can be weaponized, and you have military strategists saying, and other big thinkers saying, China's beating us in the AI race, and sometimes it's used as a justification to crack down on the population more. Oh, we need a more compliant authoritarian system so that you know what I mean, so that for our security. But yeah, so I think they really are wrecking their data. And so
Yeah.
how if this is an existential priority, right? An existential threat, you need to have good AI. Well, AI mostly sometimes this gets exaggerated, but if you have bad data, you have bad AI, right? There's a lot more that goes into AI, but um it's suicidal to do this
Right.
kind of censorship. Although if you think about it, how does China still have good data if they have even more censorship than we do? Um, yeah, but with the Google thing, I have not done a lot of that myself. I've certainly experienced the anybody who does digging, does research,
Hmm.
knows how much harder it is now to find things.
Right. Yeah. I haven't done any kind of systematic study. I don't even know how I would at this point,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
because you can't compare to what it was like 5 years ago. But I mean, it is orders of magnitude harder to find certain things, I think, now than it used to be.
And I hear people saying that things are being scrubbed. They'll say, it generally means removed. I
Right.
think, and everyone's always looking for a better search engine that doesn't skew the results. Like Google's just almost a useless tool now, unless you're looking for like what the mainstream media is promoting,
Right.
or you take some knowledge from what they're hiding is what you want to look for, that kind of thing. But I don't think they can scrub, you know, the actual material on my website. You'd have to hack to do that. So,
Right.
you just the access mechanism, the search engine, uh you just that's what you do the manipulation for. You either just remove it from the search engine altogether, or you bury it, you just mess with the ranking and
Yeah.
just throw it into the
And I remember this is a slightly different topic, but the same is that James Corbett talked about this, I remember recently, where it really looked like Google killed RSS as much as they possibly could because they had Google Reader, which was a very good, really usable, easy to use
right.
RSS reader that people loved, and just killed it for no apparent reason. And now it seems to be getting harder to kind of find RSS on a lot of sites, and there aren't really that great of RSS readers out there from what I can see. I mean, there are and they're usable, but it,
Feedly is one of them.
yeah, Feedly is the one I still use, and it is good, but the RSS breaks a lot. You have to re-find the link for a lot of stuff, and um, it really, I don't know. James Corbett had a little bit more to it, but there's definitely some. There's been long-term manipulation, I think. I mean, they got
Right.
everybody on board with Google and then slowly made it worse and worse, and more filtered and less of the kind of wild west of the internet that we used to have, I guess.
Yeah, and there's as an extension to that, podcasters are really concerned about that because I mean there's been pretty much stated goals of messing with the people saying, there's still one place out there where we're not able to take control of the information, and that's podcast networks.
Yeah.
And so, you could look at Joe Rogan's move to Spotify's being signal, Spotify's not using RSS, but
Right.
also some things like, and I don't know if this happened, but Libsyn, which is sort of one of the original. It's like most people don't even know how they're getting their podcasts, but there's like a
Hmm.
mothership where you upload all the stuff. It's the
Right.
repository, and um, and then there's an RSS file, which is just a very simple protocol, really simple syndication. I guess one of the original, or um, a basic internet protocol, and then anybody can find it, right? They can just go to if they have the RSS feed, they have a link to the file, and they can get the podcast. So,
Right.
but Google was already, they had stepped into the podcast business there, but they put it under Google Music. They're a little scrambled on what their goals were there, it seemed like, but now
Yeah.
they're getting more. iTunes really dominated that realm,
Right.
but I haven't seen it. I don't think it's going to be a fast move, but it's going to be a slow evolution, um, where they're certainly going to try to get more control over podcasts. So
Definitely. And there's already a kind of consolidation, kind of in the way that there was with radio in the 90s and stuff, where a few podcast networks are buying up a lot of content. And so a lot of it is being done through iHeartRadio, all these, like, my wife's really into true crime podcasts. So it's like half the podcasts she listens to are all through iHeartRadio, which is Clear Channel, which owns all those radio stations. And, there's other ones like, I'm blanking on some of the names right now, but
there's like Podbean and there's Spreaker, but those are a
well,
little different. They're
those,
not giant networks like
yeah,
iHeart, like
I
you
was
said.
talking more about the kind of production ones. Spotify is doing it. Stitcher started moving into like a premium service where they have certain podcasts, and there's one that's like Glowery or something. But anyway, it's just to say that I think it will move, as it becomes bigger and bigger business, it will move in the direction that these things always move into, which is consolidation under a few different corporations.
Yeah, and I think
Unfortunately.
2016 was a turning point there. They're like, how did this happen? And that's when they really started going after the alternative media. Um,
Yeah.
and that's when the establishment suddenly realized that podcasts were, they just saw it as an irrelevant ankle biters before that, but then all of a sudden Hillary Clinton gets a podcast, and
Yeah.
everybody and his brother gets a podcast.
Yeah.
Most people
Yeah.
won't do it though, like unlike a lot of us who do it on shoestring budget, most people won't do it without a big paycheck. So there's those kinds of networks too where
Hmm.
yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to touch on that censorship uh, thing, because it's a basic freedom of speech issue. It's being, and I'm afraid that not enough people are worried about that kind of thing. I really
Right.
hate to say you should be worried about this. You should think this. You should be afraid of that. That cringe when people do that in their
Yeah. I
shows. But
was,
I should just say I am very worried about it. Yeah.
yeah. And I think getting back to COVID and censorship, I mean, I think you're seeing it a lot. You saw it a lot with hydroxychloroquine, which as a treatment for COVID, there was a lot of suppression of that. And now you're seeing it with ivermectin,
Yep.
where there's a ton of suppression. I think, is it Brett or Eric Weinstein?
It's Brett. Yeah.
Brett Weinstein. Any time he's done an ivermectin, and I'm not really a fan of that guy, but
I got a lot of
he,
mixed feelings, but
yeah,
that work is important work he's doing. Yeah.
yeah, but he is covering this in a way that, as far as I can tell, is completely responsible. I mean, there's no reason that you should be kicked off YouTube for doing a video like that.
With
So
doctors and experts.
Yeah,
And the
exactly.
inventor of the original mRNA base level technology. I mean,
Yeah,
come on.
exactly. Right. And anybody who does anything related to vaccines, I mean, there's just huge suppression there. RFK Jr. getting kicked off Instagram, I
Yep.
think, was a big one, which for some reason is the main place he posted. I don't know exactly why that
I never
was, but
understood that either. Well, it's always get the base of the website, Children's Health Defense. And
he does. Yeah. And I was surprised to find that they do not get a warning page. I was almost sure they would, but I tested it out on Twitter. I mean, I tested it out yesterday, and they haven't been slapped with that yet. But I feel like, I don't know, they're due as far as Twitter is concerned.
Yeah, I think they. This is just my own speculation. I think they wanted to be careful about how they handled him.
That may be true. Yeah, he does. You know, people do know who he is, and there's a lot of affection for the Kennedys, and yeah. So and he's. I mean, it's been kind of amazing that he uses the status that he has to go into directions that are,
Really is.
you know, really, really heavily policed. So, I mean, I definitely have respect for him for doing that.
Yeah, exactly. And he's now, instead of doing, now that he can't do Instagram, he's got a podcast. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
called The Defender. I'll link one of those interviews too for people who aren't aware of that. And
Yeah.
he speaks his mind, and
Yeah.
and he's got the creds because he's not a newcomer. That's another thing I wanted to mention, because before we finish, I want to ask you some of your what you think some of the most significant articles are, and so on. And I'm going to link to your other deep dive interviews that I know of, and maybe you could tell me some more of them too. Um, and of course, people should follow you on Twitter, because anybody who's doing a lot of research and putting it all out there with source material, with deserves respect, whether you agree with them politically on it or on anything else. Um, but now I lost my train of thought. Oh darn it! I was going to say something and I forget. It'll come to me. So let me go with that before we wrap up. Like, what do you think? Maybe you could highlight a few of your most important, enlightening, surprising things that you have found and put out there for the rest of us to look at.
Sure. So, I mean, one thing that I'll point people toward, which I alluded to kind of at the beginning of the interview, is this FOIA request that I made to the
Yeah.
CDC. So I'll tell the backstory to that a little bit. So what happened is in 2019, US AMRID, which is the US Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases, I think maybe I got that long acronym right, which is located at Fort Detrick and is really the main facility at Fort Detrick, and it's a series of labs. It includes a BSL-4, which is the highest level biosafety lab you can have. Anyway, it was shut down by the CDC for a time in 2019 in the summer for not entirely clear how long, but like a month or so. And so a lot of people online have been kind of bringing this up in the context of COVID. Some people just saying, hey, we're talking about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Maybe we should be looking at what happened, right at home in Fort Detrick. And other people, speculating that this is a possibility that COVID even may have come from Fort Detrick. And they would point to, there's a story in Northern Virginia, which is not too far from Frederick, Maryland, maybe 40 minutes an hour. There was a big kind of mysterious pneumonia, respiratory illness outbreak at a nursing home there. And some other things that happened around there that looked like they could be COVID before the fact or whatever. So anyway, there was an article written about it in the Frederick News Post,
I
which is
saw
the
that.
local
The
Frederick
local
outlet.
news, yeah.
Yeah. And so that article, she had actually requested the cease and desist letter, or the letter of concern, I think is what they call it, telling them to shut down.
That local news?
The local news did, yeah. Well, I think there's more to it than just local news,
And
though, because
who did the cease and desist?
the CDC sent a letter to
Okay.
US AMRID because they had done inspections there and found containment issues and shut them down for a time until they corrected the issues. And like I said, the Frederick News Post did get the letter that the CDC sent to them, but only requested the letter, however you want to call it, the letter that shut them down.
I got it. Okay, I got it.
And so that did, it showed certainly some interesting and unusual containment issues. They were related to aerosolized particles and aerosol containment, so things that spread through the air, which we know that COVID does, for example. But I will say that the woman, I actually reached out to her. So sorry, I'm getting too scattered. But anyway, so she wrote the article. She had gotten that letter, and then in January of, I guess, 2020 is when it would have been, if I have it right. A WJLA, which is a Washington DC based ABC affiliate, there was a reporter there who had done a broader request and gotten some basically a full chain of things from the CDC, including emails and including some other information. And she wrote an article about it. And what her article mentioned things that were not in the Frederick News Post article. And what it specifically talked about was a guy going in and out of a room where they were doing a necropsy on a non-human primate infected with a select agent. And select agent is the euphemism for the most infectious and, most dangerous kinds of viruses and things like that.
But no specifics on what it was, right?
Yes, no specifics on what it was. And so that includes Ebola, it includes SARS-like coronaviruses, it includes smallpox.
Something really dangerous.
Yeah, anthrax, all that kind of stuff. And so she had these bits of information in there about these non-human primates that were infected with this select agent, and that there are all these containment issues related to it. Well, none of that was in the letter that the Frederick News Post had released. And so that was where my interest and confusion came from. So I reached out to the reporter from WJLA to see if she had the actual FOIA documents, because none of that was attached to the article. And she said that she had moved on to a different job. She didn't have it anymore. And she was very helpful and pointed me toward the CDC site in how to request, do a FOIA request.
But you would have to do your own?
Yeah, to do my own, because
the public doesn't have access to things that other people FOIA'd?
So I thought that they should, but apparently not. And she had a link to be where she originally was able to get the documents, and that link had been shut down in the meantime. But I think that is the standard procedure as far as the CDC FOIA goes, from what I could tell.
The standard procedures that you don't have access, or you do have access to?
That they shut down access after a certain point.
Must be a short period of time.
Well, it was so it was January of 2020 that she had originally gotten it, I think. So this was about a year later that I was talking to her. And okay. I don't know. I don't know if there was any gamesmanship there on the CDC side. But what I will say is she was very helpful. And the woman who had written the article for the Frederick News Post was extremely not helpful. And she actually linked, and when I asked her about this, she linked me to that AP News article about, coronavirus misinformation super spreaders, and to an article she had written about how Fort Detrick had nothing to do with this, and this is all disinformation and yada, yada, yada.
Hmm.
So, she is a reporter. I think she may have moved on since then, but working at Fort Detrick is located in Frederick. That's probably the big industry. And so anybody who's covering Fort Detrick regularly is probably going to, have some filtering going on. But this woman from WJLA was not. She was a very young reporter. I think had just, made the request and maybe not thought a ton about it in an article. And that was kind of that. But anyway, so what I did with the CDC was that they're hugely backed up with FOIA requests because everybody's requesting everything because of COVID. So what I did was say, just give me I did it one way and they kind of said this is going to take months to do or whatever. Yeah. And so I came back and I said, just give me exactly what you gave to Diana DeGangi, who's the reporter for WJLA. And that worked pretty well. They got back to me within a few weeks and sent me exactly what they had sent her. And so I had a kind of Twitter friend of mine, Our Hidden History, who runs a great site and posts a bunch of great stuff on YouTube. He put it on his archive.org page. So, it's publicly available out there. And what it showed is that the CDC, and I haven't gone through it quite as closely with as much of a fine tooth comb as I wanted. But what it showed is that the CDC sent 2 different letters to USAMRIID. And one of them was in, I think, sometime around April 2019, and the other was around July 2019. And the first one had to do with and it had all the information about the non-human primates being infected with select agents, the thing about the necropsy table. There were other containment issues with the area where they have all the cages of the infected primates. And the big, question or the big sticking point with all of it is, what is the select agent? Because it's redacted throughout the entire chain of emails and the 2 letters. It never reveals what the select agent is. So, if there's any possibility it's a SARS-like coronavirus, that would obviously be hugely upsetting for the narrative around where COVID came from. I don't know how likely that really is. There are a lot of factors that would weigh against it. It would have meant that there was an outbreak in the United States for, over half a year before anybody caught on to it, which I would say is not impossible. But, certainly there would be a lot more you would have to dig through to figure it out. Or it's something else, and I don't know what it is. But the problem, the thing is, there is some kind of containment issue happening at Fort Detrick involving the most dangerous pathogens that the government has in its control. And for some reason, we are not entitled as, U.S. citizens to know what that is. I mean, that seems pretty outlandish to me. And there were also containment issues involving wastewater containment. That there was a lot of flooding in Frederick, and apparently it flooded the wastewater containment facilities or something. And so there was a bunch of flooding that, could, if that had any kind of pathogen in it, which seemed possible, it's possible it would have gotten out into the community there. So there's a ton of concerns there. And I've been hoping that some journalist would kind of take it up and run with it a little bit more than I'm able to, working a full-time job and stuff. It's just not super easy for me to dig through it that much. And as I also alluded to, the Global Times did write an article where they cited to that FOIA request and spelled it out a little bit. They dug into it a little bit, and it's obviously written with a, heavily, trying to paint Fort Detrick as being very unsafe, kind of in reaction to the WIV stuff, I'm sure. But it is a worthwhile article and worth looking at, because it does go through the email chains a little bit. It shows that one of the people involved in the chain of the inspections and the containment issues, his job title, his name was redacted, but his job title was available. And it's, I want to say his job title involves countering weapons of mass destruction. So, that's sort of a troubling
Yeah.
kind of job title for somebody to be involved in a containment issue like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
glad that you
he's
brought that.
director for strategic studies, in parentheses, countering weapons of mass destruction at USAMRIID. So
Great. Huh. No, I'm glad you brought that up because I know that's some of your most recent stuff.
mhm.
And I wish we had more. I really got to let you go. It's a holiday and we've been going for a while, but I don't know. Maybe we can continue to just kind of hash through some of these things because, it's really valuable. Not everybody, who have other jobs and everything else can go through all of this material, but we can help each other. And I really appreciate all the work that you've done on this,
Mhm.
and the time that you spent today. I really do appreciate it. If there's anything else that you want to bring up, I have like 20 more things I would want to talk about, but yeah, not today. But if there's anything else you want to bring up before we wrap it up, please do that. And also, please make sure you tell everybody where to find your work.
Sure, yeah. So all my work is on Twitter, and there is, I guess, some risk in that if they're going to continue to censor people, and certainly they ban people arbitrarily. So I hope that doesn't happen. I try to download my archives, so at least it's there. But anyway, that Gumby at Gumby, the number 4 Christ is the Twitter handle, so you can find me there. And as far as other things I've been looking at, just because Donald Rumsfeld died recently, I was looking at some stuff related to him, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
I think probably related to the topics we've been talking about, the thing that is most interesting is that he was head of Gilead Sciences, which is the company that developed remdesivir, which is, like I said, currently the only approved treatment for COVID as far as the FDA is concerned. And that remdesivir was developed by Ralph Baric, who did all this coronavirus research. So there's all these ties there. One of the interesting things I found recently is that Rumsfeld, you could do like multi-part episode on Rumsfeld's entire history. But one thing that he was involved in at Gilead was a drug called, it's got some name that's difficult to pronounce, like cidofovir or something. And it was originally developed as an AIDS medication. And as far as I know, didn't really seem to work that well, like a lot of things that Gilead seemed to be involved in. And cidofovir. And so in November 2001, Anthony Fauci was all around the media because the anthrax attacks were happening. And so there was all this freak out about what we're going to do to protect ourselves against bioweapons attacks, bioterrorism in the United States. And so one of the things he was promoting, and they promoted this for years as a possibility, was that they were going to do basically a mass vaccination campaign of like the entire US public against smallpox, because for some reason they had targeted smallpox as being like the pathogen the bioterrorists were going to use.
Mm-hmm.
Dark Winter, the simulation that
Right.
kind of eerily mirrored the anthrax attacks. Smallpox is actually the pathogen that was involved there. And so there was all this talk about smallpox, but the problem was the US government had stockpiled a bunch of smallpox vaccines that were from like the 70s or something, because smallpox had basically been eradicated by that point. But they still had the stockpiles. But the stockpiles of this vaccine, it was known to be toxic in a not insignificant number of people, that allergic reactions were happening. And so they had different solutions for what they were going to do. Maybe they would just dilute the vaccines and that would work. Or they had some other ideas, but one of them was they were going to take this drug cidofovir, which had some kind of effect against smallpox, and give it to you with the vaccine. And somehow that would make the vaccine less toxic. So if they had ever gone forward with this mass smallpox vaccination campaign, Gilead would have just, exploded in value because they were providing this essential component to the vaccination campaign. And that never ended up happening. What did end up happening is that there was a whole bird flu scare that people may remember in the late Bush era. And this was, as far as I can tell, basically totally ginned up or trumped up or just oversold. And, there was very little risk. There were not a lot of breakouts, but one of the things that that happened with that is that all these countries, including the U.S. and like 60 other countries, started stockpiling Tamiflu. And Tamiflu it's not a vaccine. It's something else, I believe. It's some kind of bird flu drug, but I think you do take it as a shot. And it was developed by Gilead. And so Gilead, technically Gilead had sold the rights to make it to somebody else, but they basically made a royalty on every single Tamiflu shot. And Donald Rumsfeld still owned a huge amount of shares in Gilead. And so he ended up making millions of dollars off of this fake bird flu epidemic because all of these countries were stockpiling Tamiflu, and the Gilead stock price went through the roof, which is similar to what happened.
While he was still in government. Yeah.
Yes, while he was still in government. Exactly.
Yeah.
So
created some business for himself.
Yeah, Donald Rumsfeld has such a fascinating and dark history. Like I was just looking back at some other things I looked at from him. Like he was put in charge of a commission when he wasn't in government in like 2000 to investigate the weaponization of space, which of course, is still a big deal. And one of the, actually Whitney Webb and Robbie Martin had a conversation about this, but the Securing America's Defenses or Restoring America's Defenses, the big PNAC document that has the new Pearl Harbor quote, a lot of that is really about the weaponization of space and how the US needed to counter China in the, the space realm. And so Rumsfeld started warning about, and this is literally the phrase he used, I believe, a space Pearl Harbor that was going to happen, and how, we would need to be prepared to counter, attacks in space. And he also stated that Osama bin Laden might attack the US's satellite system in space. So, pretty bizarre thing to be doing in like late 2000, early 2001, certainly right before 9/11. And I mean, there's a whole 9/11 rabbit hole with him, of course, but the big thing is with
but these ideas don't die. They crop up again, like a decade later. And now they're throwing all this UFO stuff out there. You got Tucker Carlson doing UFO segments. Like, what?
Yeah, exactly.
They already got a boost in their budget. What are they trying to? Anyway, so Rumsfeld was, and the PNAC thing was all about space, right?
A big piece of it was really about the militarization of space, which certainly they're still talking about with China. China, or space is now I forget what phrase they use, but like an operational battlefield or whatever. They're trying to make the Arctic. There's a whole militarization of the Arctic that's happening too, to counter Russia and China, because all the ice caps are. Yeah, exactly. Because all the ice caps are melting, and so they're sending battleships up through the Arctic, I guess. But yeah, Rumsfeld, like I said, is one of is a guy I've been digging into a little bit recently. There's certainly the continuity of government stuff that he was involved in with Dick Cheney, and even when they were out of government, they were still basically heading up this continuity of government thing, which was establishing the measures for what would happen in case of a national emergency, which basically involves consolidating a lot of power in the hands of people like Cheney and Rumsfeld.
Yeah, that is a particularly interesting subject, and great time to go through and do a review of the Rumsfeld stuff. There's been a lot of work done on him, but kind of revisiting some of those things right now is a great idea. In fact, I had brought up with a friend of mine, maybe we did something like that on John Brennan, a 3-part series on his career. It'd be a great time to do something like that on Rumsfeld. But in any case, I hope you come back so we can continue some of this conversation, because it's overwhelming. There was a long period of time when I just ignored a lot of these things because it's just too much. It was just overload. But I guess the fog has cleared a little bit anyway, and it'd be great to talk to you about some more of these things that all in this age of secrecy. You have to find other ways to come to conclusions, or at least sort of sort out your options on what you think is at least credible, for things where we may not ever get a real answer. This may be one of them, it may be not. And the other one last point I want to make is that decades ago, there were clearer lines between government and the private sector, I think. And those things are really blurred. They became blurred in the intelligence arena. They became more and more blurred in the military arena. And I think it's really clear from what we've seen throughout this COVID thing that they are really blurred in the medical establishment and the quote unquote bio defense establishment. And we can see sort of open competition between some of the players, and God only knows what's going on in the back rooms.
Right.
Yeah. So that makes it even more complicated to figure out what's going on. And multinational. Oh, I forgot that part. You got we didn't get into it, but you got the British part of this and the European part of this. The Wellcome and all those guys.
Wellcome Trust and
right.
And universities too, especially on the medical side, are really deeply enmeshed in this whole thing too,
and dependent on. I meant to mention Richard E. Bright too as another person who I think is a good person to watch, because he's not a newcomer to this. His objections to gain of function and warning signs and things like that, and he's at Rutgers, which is my I'm an alum there. So but I've watched that over the years become more and more captured by corporate money. It's a research institution now, which means tons of private money going into it. And the whole medical establishment, I think, even over the last 20 years, let's say since 9/11, things have changed a lot. They keep getting more and more blurry.
Yeah,
so
it's true. And it does go back further with the universities. The thing I talked about with my family and the aerosolized experiments, those were done in conjunction with this guy who was at Washington University, which is the big research university here in St. Louis. So, there are connections, but I think, it's gotten even worse and worse, especially with how much money was poured into that whole, the whole biodefense realm post the anthrax attacks.
Yeah.
And then SARS-1 was also, I think, a big factor too, because that's what really got people freaked out about that there is going to be, it's imminent that there will be a pandemic of some kind. And so a lot of money poured into, kind of militarized and shady biodefense stuff related to pandemics as well.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up there, and let's continue next time we can. And happy holiday weekend. I hope you have a lot of fun. And again, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Oh yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Gumby. Follow him on Twitter at Gumby4Christ. This podcast, independent media, listener support's really important. Rockfin.com/AroundTheEmpire, Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. Find it on any mobile podcast app. It's also on Rockfin, on YouTube, and on Patreon. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody, and happy 4th of July holiday.